Welcome in our today's episode. This one is a bit of a special one and therefore a bit longer. I'm talking to David Luke. Now, David is one of the world's leading researchers when it comes to human exceptional experiences. It includes dreams, it includes psychedelic experiences, and he's also one of the leading researchers in modern psychedelic research. His work touches different parts of our life. He is interested in the psychology of these experiences. But most importantly, his research evokes this sense of curiosity, which is somehow fundamental to being human. So, a lot of things which you would hear in this conversation is covered in detail in a book which he wrote recently, which is it's called DMT Dialogues, which is included in the link. So let's welcome our guest for today, David Luke. So how would you like to introduce your research? Because I mean, it's easier to talk about something and say that, oh, it's fantastic, but I truly believe that the work you're doing, it is mind-blowing, actually literally and figuratively. That is what you experience, and it is fantastic. So it is hard for me to actually give a 1-2 line introduction because you do touch few different kind of areas. So it would be great if you can, introduce what are the touchdown kind of areas, and then for sure I would love to know more about it.
Sure, fantastic. Well, thanks for the invitation. I guess the large umbrella you could put over all of my work is that it explores the psychology of altered states of consciousness and what I call exceptional human experience. So that might be out-of-body experiences or near-death experiences, mystical experiences, and so on, that are induced through some kind of technique of going into an altered state of consciousness, be it meditation or dreams or hypnosis or some shamanic techniques or psychoactive substances, psychedelic drugs. So that's the kind of broad area. And so I'm in a kind of niche research field, so it's kind of a broad domain, and within it there's I have a lot of different angles on my research. So I take a kind of from hard kind of neuroscientific approach to pure ethnography, rolling my sleeves up and getting my hands dirty with indigenous tribes, for instance, doing ethnography.
So I would love to know a bit more about the field work, because generally what I've listened to or I've read the research mostly in the labs.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting because I think there are very few people who cross over, so we actually go to the field. And are you also participating with the indigenous cultures?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I take a kind of participant observation approach, so I've engaged in various activities and ceremonies and so on and so forth with mediums and shamans, primarily in various parts of the world, mostly in South America and Central America. Actually, in fact, mostly Mexico.
Okay. So now I guess the word, which we would be saying that a lot, which is psychedelics.
Mm-hmm.
And this is something which means somehow that your mind and your brain and you are having a conscious altering experience. And that's what one of the big aspects of your research is. So psychedelics come from different methods. It could be somehow attained endogenously,
Mm-hmm.
and it could be attained through different drugs or plants, whatever the term you want to use. So what is your definition about this experience?
I guess the easiest way to kind of categorize them are that many drugs have psychoactive effects, like coffee or cocaine or alcohol, but they're usually a matter of degree in terms of how things shift, so they're kind of quantitative changes in your kind of normal state of functioning, whereas psychedelics have profound qualitative changes in your sense of everything, basically, your consciousness, your conscious experience, your sense of time, your sense of your body, your sense of meaning, your emotions. Everything can shift and change under the influence of psychedelics.
So now, why would we do this research? I mean, first of all, this is one of the biggest issues because it's a very controversial topic. Some of it is still banned, and few of the substances are now allowed to do research on. So, of course, I mean, anyone who hears about psychedelic, anyone who hears about anything which is related to this drug, they still think that what is the point when we know that it is very dangerous and that's the reason why it was banned. So, I mean, what would be the what can we first initially talk about, and what are you finding out? Like, what is the initial reason for actually doing the research?
So I'll probably kind of contextualize it historically because these substances first started coming to light in the kind of about the 1950s in a big way, in a serious way, when they started being researched in earnest, and they started looking at various psychotherapeutic potentials of using psychedelic substances within psychiatry and psychotherapy. And during the 50s and 60s, they did find many potential uses for them as treatments. And then, of course, the 1960s kind of cultural hippie era began, the human potential movement and so on. And there was a big cultural backlash to that. And, of course, they were then became prohibited. But it didn't stop people taking them. In fact, the number of people taking these drugs, as with all drugs, has steadily increased over the last 50 years, despite prohibition. But what it did do is it stopped scientific research with humans with psychedelics. So a lot of the research that's happening now, which is we're in this kind of psychedelic research renaissance, and suddenly these substances are being explored at various institutions and universities. They're starting off by initially going back and retesting all these kind of early findings of their clinical uses and benefits. So that's one of the kind of uses of psychedelic research currently is looking at the therapeutic potential. So the use of psilocybin for depression, treatment of addictions, treating end-of-life anxiety and depression associated with terminal cancer, for instance, or the use of MDMA for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. And the kind of initial findings seem to support everything that we thought in the 1950s and 60s, that these have a huge potential in treating very difficult to treat psychological conditions, addictions, depression, anxiety, and so on and so forth. So that's one whole arm of it. There's the clinical benefits, which is huge. It shouldn't be understated. Psychiatry is in a kind of a state of crisis. It hasn't really progressed significantly in the last 100 years. My colleagues will say actually the best treatment for depression is still ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, but that has huge side effects, and it's somewhat barbaric, you could say, and isn't well understood either. Whereas we have this whole new raft, or an old or revisited raft of potential treatments within psychedelics for treating all these difficult conditions. And the preliminary findings are hugely supportive of their potential to treat these conditions. So that's one whole side of it. And then there is a whole raft of other related research, such as neuroscience and psychology and biomedicine, and understanding, the nature of consciousness and the mind and cognition through the exploration of these psychoactive substances, because we can understand the underlying chemistry. The chemistry is known pretty well. We understand, therefore, more about the underlying neurobiology, and that can tell us a lot about the ordinary neurobiology of consciousness as well. By perturbing the brain or kind of making these changes to consciousness, we can see how these effects have underlying brain mechanisms, which we can understand much more about. Then there's a whole other raft of kind of possible research avenues, and my own particular flavour is exploring the psychological components, but on the more exotic end of the scale. So a lot of altered states, and particularly psychedelics, give rise to all kinds of what we might call transpersonal or exceptional experiences, where people feel like they're transcending their ordinary ego identity and connecting with something beyond them, be it another person or another species, or some kind of spiritual experience, connection of unity, consciousness or somehow some kind of cosmic experience, not in a hippie kind of cosmic way. But so these are very prevalent experiences, and yet they're poorly understood. So there's a whole area of research to explore there. And just to add that, all the mystical kind of experiences, these transpersonal experiences, also bear a lot of relevance on the clinical work, because we're finding that in those studies where they're using, say, psilocybin for depression or end-of-life cancer or addictions, the people who fare the best, who have the best clinical outcomes, are those people who have these full mystical experiences under the influence of the psilocybin. So there's some important relevance there for the clinical side of things as well.
Yeah, and I mean, this is not surprising just because I think there is a lineage of knowledge which is somehow a bit broken, because these are the substances and the plants which I think our civilization and humans are using for at least thousands of years, if not more. And there has been a lot of documented proof about it. I don't think this is anyway some sort of a controversial thing to say.
No.
So I mean, so that means that somehow this is part of our evolution, and of course, if humans are using it and we are co-evolving somehow with the plants, and whether or not, I mean, we can come to it later on in the discussion if it is an evolutionary advantage or not to have a conscious altering experience, and that's how you get to it. But either or not, if you are used to it, and if humans are using it for decades or thousands of years, clearly there would be some sort of use, some sort of an advantage which you are getting, even on just personal level, even on social level, even within 100 years. So I mean, what is the story of this co-evolution?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a super fascinating question. Like you say, we have evidence to suggest that, you know, our indigenous forebears, people in shamanic cultures around the world, so-called, have been using these substances for thousands of years, maybe tens of thousands of years in some cases, from archaeological evidence, possibly much longer. You know, there's speculations that the earliest human art, you know, Upper Paleolithic rock art, shows all the telltale signs of being created under the influence of, you know, an altered state of consciousness, which could have been derived from taking plant or fungal psychedelics, or it could be just being in the dark recess of a cave, or drumming or chanting or something. But our ancestors appear to have been inspired through their altered states to create the very first human art. And that's, you know, it's fairly well considered debate in archaeology. So the provenance of this is ancient, it seems. And as for the evolutionary benefits, well, it could have, in fact, initiated a cultural explosion with art and all the concomitant changes in the shift of human evolution that happened whenever that was, when they were doing that. I'm not an archaeologist, but I think what we're looking at, something like up to 100,000 years ago or something like that, maybe the maximum. So there are other potential advantages as well, not least for, of course, you know, social cohesion, lack of depression and anxiety and things, which are to some extent 21st century diseases as well. You know, urbanization it has a profound effect on increasing the prevalence of these kind of conditions. But maybe our ancestors in the past also benefited from the use of psychoactive plants for various social dimensions and psychological dimensions too. On a more kind of cultural evolutionary standpoint as well, there's a fairly good body of evidence to suggest that altered states of consciousness are also very useful for innovation and creative problem solving. So there's a raft of innovations and discoveries which came through dreams, for instance. Auguste Kekule, discovery of the benzene ring, Mendeleev's discovery of the periodic table, Einstein's theory of relativity, is it Bohr, I think, and the structure of the atom, etc., etc. These are all inspired by experiences in an altered state, dreams in this case. And we also have evidence that other altered states have also been useful for innovations and at least one Nobel Prize, if not numerous. For instance, Kary Mullis, won the Nobel Prize for his discovery of PCR polymerase chain reaction, whereby you're able to replicate a single strand of DNA, which is hugely important for all genetic research and advancements. And he did that under the influence of LSD. He was inspired by his use of LSD, enabled him to visualize the DNA molecules at a very kind of detailed level, which led to his discovery. He was on record about that. There's also some stories that Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of DNA itself, was also on LSD at the time when he made his discovery. Now, we don't know that for certain. It's probably apocryphal, but we do know he did enjoy taking LSD. We just don't know if he did when he made his discovery. So, I mean, that's just the kind of the anecdotal stuff, if you like. But there's also kind of good research, scientific research, to suggest that psychedelics and other altered states can enhance what we call divergent thinking, the ability to make fresh associations of existing ideas and knowledge and put them together in novel ways and come up with new solutions to old problems, as opposed to our ordinary everyday linear or convergent kind of thinking, which is some more logical and stepwise, but not very good for insight and inspiration.
Yeah, and I mean, there's as you're saying, there's tons of research done, and I'm a big fan of Stephen Kotler and Jamie Wheal. They have done a lot of research, and they've written a book called Stealing Fire, and all of their research is about flow states. And I mean, what is flow state? Where there are 4 neurochemicals which they mention, and I even if you have a gun on me, I can't remember what are those 4. It's a hard pronunciation, but they activate, and then you are in a flow state, which means that whatever your default network is, as you mentioned, which is our rational problem-solving mindset. So it somehow knocks off one of our old connections. So our neurons are forced to form some sort of novel connection, which gives you those lateral creative ideas. Now, we know, of course, in this place where we are right now, I mean, we have mental crisis. Not only that, we are becoming global civilization, and we are getting more individualistic, and we don't know how to actually connect with each other. And not only that, but actually evolutionary biologists, which I've talked to or listened to, some of the good educators who you would want them to lead or teach or tell you ideas, even if they are not in the favor of psychedelic as such in open, because of course it's a very tricky thing to engage in. They are recommending, and some other journalists, that if I definitely want to listen to them, I respect them, and they are respected. And they are actually mentioning that if you want to solve these problems, it's not a hard problem. These are now wicked problems. Like there's no good way out. You have to somehow think outside of the framework where we are embedded. And as you're mentioning about the creative problem solving, if somehow we have to understand what our default network is, we have to get out of that network and somehow see it outside of it. So as you mentioned, that cave painting. So I was reading that, and so I of course I went through your book, which is DMT Dialogues. I mean, this is brilliant. I thought that it's I wish I can make a movie out of it.
We're making one.
Oh yeah. Oh, you are. Oh, yeah. Perfect. That is brilliant. Exactly. That's perfect. So, well, there was one. I'm not sure if it was Dennis McKenna or someone was mentioning these cave paintings and sensory deprivation. Yeah. So if we just look at the argument as an Occam's razor, if you take any kind of psychedelics, and if you see those same half human and half animal people, and I've looked at those paintings, or not on that, or you can go for you can go into the sensory deprivation, and if you see something very similar, the simplest and the most scientific explanation, according to the theory, which is the most important theory, is that clearly, probably, either they were doing some sort of a sensory deprivation, or they were experiencing those state at that time somehow without without any other way, or maybe it was endogenous, but that's like a jump
Sure.
at that point, or they were just clearly taking mushrooms or something at that point. I mean, this is very on the surface. It has no jumps and hoops in
Sure.
that.
Yeah, it's currently probably one of the most favoured explanations for a Paleolithic rock art, that it's taken fairly substantially well that our ancestors were in these altered states. We don't know the exact techniques perhaps they were using. It's an interesting idea that you talk. It could be endogenous, i.e. that they could be creating the altered states through their own neurobiology, which is also an interesting point because although most psychedelic plants and fungus, obviously you're ingesting them, they have component chemicals that are found also in humans. So, they act on the serotonergic system, but DMT, for instance, which is, for instance, the active chemical in ayahuasca and other substances, is found in the human body. So it's like we have our own psychedelics in our body. And even just breathing, chanting or over-breathing can get you into an altered state by altering your oxygen carbon dioxide ratios. Again, not well understood, but it has profound effects on your state of consciousness. So our own inner chemistry is exquisitely tuned to going into altered states, be it through the introduction of outside chemicals or the ones that we already have inside us. So altered states are inherent to our being, really, but we've kind of been shuttled into this use of just kind of coffee, primarily tea, and alcohol and sugar, and those kind of like low-level altered states. Even dreams, which everybody does, aren't really well regarded in our culture, whereas in other cultures they have a deep and profound position within their society. Some communities like the Shuar, for instance, will get up very, very early in the morning, and the family will get together and they'll share their dreams, and they'll make all their decisions for the rest of the day based on what comes through in their dreams, be it from the child or from the elder or from the mother or the father.
I mean, as you talked about different cultures. So I've grown up in Pakistan. I've also been actually part of some other culture's life by just being there and living there. So there's a very important point in actually, I think all of Abrahamic religions, and also in the cultures over there, that they say that 3 a.m. to somehow 5 a.m. It's
Exactly,
a very important time to pray.
Yes.
Now, I was actually reading one of your papers, which is about doing the graveyard shift.
Yeah.
Such an interesting name. But and also one of the research you did about when your participant wake up and they actually record the dreams which they are having. And now, whatever I've heard, all the stories and all the myths, that's how I've grown up most of my life over there. They definitely say that if you wake up at that time and then whatever dream state you are at, and then you are praying. And now of course, praying is a very controversial problem right now. And I mean, I'm not going to get into even rationally defend it. So, and you are praying, and that actually affected how people lived and talked to their inner self.
Absolutely.
For centuries. So clearly there is a cross-reference around the world about this timing.
Yeah, very much. I think people in the ancient traditions were much more attuned to these kind of sensitivities, different stages of the daily cycles, the seasons, and so on and so forth, and lived in a kind of more natural world in a way. I mean, our melatonin cycles as moderns living in urban environments are all over the place, but in an ordinary melatonin cycle, the chemical that's released by your pineal gland, which induces sleep, it typically reaches peak levels at about 3 o'clock in the morning. But ours is somewhat disrupted by the use of artificial lighting and so on and so forth. But so classically, the ancients were just in tune with this kind of free moment of like to be able to access the kind of optimum neurochemistry of their own brains. There is some speculation, of course, that DMT may also be produced in the pineal and follow these same circadian rhythms as well, in which case, you've got a higher level of a truly psychedelic chemical floating around your brain at these particular moments, which all these cultures have chosen as the best time to meditate or to pray, but not by accident.
I actually just realized, and I didn't connect that dot, that one of the research from that, it's called Flow Dojo, or Flow Genome Project. So they actually also did some fMRI studies where they actually found out beta and alpha wavelengths, where I think beta is the one, please don't quote me on this, but beta is the one where the mind is really chattery, and alpha is the one where you are very much focused. That is also peaking somewhere at 3 a.m. to 4 a.m. in the night, which is very interesting because, I mean, you're not just thinking that, oh, this is the time where I'm, most focused and connected or somehow.
No, absolutely not. I mean, there's definite physiological changes that we kind of drift in and out of throughout the course of a day. And for sure, that makes absolute sense. I'd like to see that research. That sounds very interesting.
Yeah. And another thing, because there's a lot of that's of course that's not approved, but I have met with a lot of people, well, in different communities, especially in Pakistan, where they were doing scouting to actually help different crowds control. So there's different processions, and then they train young people to awake for night. So you have to do this duty over there. So they train people to be up and be attentive. And most of the people who I know and I have shared time, they are actually addicted to, and addicted is the wrong word, but they are actually very fascinated and fond of skipping a night still, even if they don't have to do it.
Right.
Because they say that skipping a night or night and a half actually allows them, sometimes they are in some, wherever they are, allows them to be in some sort of a state where they feel a lot of opening somehow in their chest or heart, and a lot of ideas for some people come in, a lot of forgiveness for some people come in, which is also a very interesting as respect to DMT, because I remember that if you do disturb some sort of these circadian rhythms and serotonin and melatonin, I guess it might affect some sort of pineal gland, or...
It's possible. We don't know. It's speculative at this point. I mean, certainly we know that melatonin's made in the pineal gland. There's good reason to think that DMT might also be made there, but we don't know for certain. Serotonin as well. So in the daytime, your pineal makes serotonin. At night, it gets converted into melatonin. And it's also a simple conversion from serotonin to DMT if you have the right enzyme. They've found this particular chemical DMT in the pineal glands of rats, and humans aren't too dissimilar, but we haven't actually done the research yet to establish whether it truly exists in human pineal gland. But there's very good circumstantial evidence to at least explore that notion. And of course, so any kind of practices that you have which may affect your pineal gland functioning, such as changing your daylight cycles, maybe like retreats in dark rooms, that kind of thing, or even changing your sleeping cycles, can have effects on the production of the chemicals in your pineal gland, which may affect your state of consciousness.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is enough introduction. Like, I hope that anyone who's listening for the first time, they're like, okay, we know what it is. But now I would actually want to talk about one of your experiences, which I read in Psychopharmacology. Have I said it right?
Journal of Eco-Psychology.
Okay. No, I'm trying to make it overcomplicated.
Eco-Psychopharmacology. That should be a discipline. That's a really good idea.
That is.
We've just started it. That's great.
Perfect,
it's a new
perfect.
discipline.
It is. Yeah. I mean, this should be. I mean, I think why I think it should be, because one of the biggest strand which I've noticed in anyone who's doing other psychedelic research, even if they are not interested in environmentalism, they're not interested in any kind of overly careful in some sort of balances. But once you somehow experience, literally experientially, these kind of aspects, you realize the importance of it. And not only that, you realize that what actually environment which you think is separate from you is something like, I'm here. This is always the view which I've thought that I'm living, and then suddenly the bubble break where I thought, oh, I end here, and that is where I'm as if I'm in a zoo.
Yes, of course.
And that's what we think. We are in a zoo, and
yeah.
then we are looking out in a world. We don't think that we are part of this soup, and you are actually the world which you are looking at.
Absolutely.
So one of your experiences about that blade of grass, I would love to listen to that, because it is a very fascinating experience. So what was it? Where did you go?
So this was an experience I had on my first time making use of this plant called Salvia divinorum. It's a ordinary kind of plant in a way. It's part of the mint family. It's a sage plant, but it's extremely psychoactive. It has a unique kind of neurochemical signature when you take it. So it's not like any other psychedelic plant. It doesn't work in the same way, and it gives you quite a unique experience. I mean, they all supply quite unique experiences, but on this occasion, not really knowing what to expect, I found myself, my whole body was slowly petrifying from the feet and hands up, and I was kind of being rooted to the spot, quite literally. I was being turned into a small spiky shrub, and at about the same time, when I realised I'd had this complete metamorphosis and I couldn't move, I was in this huge field, an open field with some trees, and all the plants, all the trees and all the blades of grass just started laughing, like bursting with hysterics, kind of reeling backwards and forwards, going, now you know what it's like to be a plant, ha ha ha, like this, which I found somewhat terrifying at the time because, I didn't quite get the joke myself. I thought I was stuck like that. And then, of course, this voice appeared, which I interpreted to be like the voice of the earth itself, or the representative of that. And it said, you humans, you think you know what's going on around here, but you really don't have a clue. You think you're in control, but no, you're just arrogant. And I got a sound lecture from, I don't know, the spirit of the earth, and I got ridiculed by grass. That's an extremely humbling experience. And it made me think very differently about the nature of our interaction with nature. How we consider other species, not just other animals, but other species, plant and fungus species, and so on, and their regard of do they actually have consciousness, or do they have some kind of essence we can communicate with, or should we really just be thinking so arrogantly as ourselves as human beings, So yeah, that's important. I think we should generate this branch of eco-psychopharmacology because I think it is an emerging thing. Somewhat, I did the first bit of research on this kind of really a few years ago, about 5 years ago, and since then there's been a few other papers, and they've shown systematically that people who take plant psychedelics, particularly plant psychedelics, but any psychedelics, tend to become much more engaged with nature. They have an increase in their eco-consciousness. They feel more connected with nature, 100% in my survey. They tend to feel more concerned, and it also transposes into changes in behavior as well. So something like half of my sample of people who had taken psychedelics said taking psychedelics had made them do more gardening, for instance. Another half had said it made them change their diet. They started eating more vegetarian and local and organic and this kind of thing. And even down to like 16% changed their entire career. So they gave up what they were doing and did something that was more ecologically orientated as a result of taking psychedelics. For instance, 2 people quit their jobs and started doing PhDs in botany. So I think they can have a profound effect on tuning people into nature. And I think that kind of comes from it's also connected to the whole spectrum of experiences we see coming from psychedelics, from their clinical potential as well. And that is the increasing connectivity. And we see that on the biological level, on the psychological level, the social level, the environmental level, and even on the cosmic level. So the whole scale. So on the biological level, we have this turning down of the activity in the default mode network, which allows for this interconnectivity, this hyperconnectivity between different brain regions. So suddenly different parts of your brain, which never normally communicate, start talking to each other. And it gives rise to this kind of lateral thinking, this divergent thinking. On a psychological level, it also connects people with themselves, their identity, their deep unconscious psychological material and people are able to better understand themselves. So people connect with themselves as well. They also connect with other people. We see increases in empathy. We see increases in people's openness to experience. People just feel more open and able to engage with the world outside in all its facets, and feel more empathy and connection with other people. On an environmental level, as I've just said, people become more connected with nature, and which is hugely important right now. We are actually in the biggest mass extinction in 66 million years. It's the sixth mass extinction in the whole time of life on this planet. It's the sixth one in millions of years. So this is a big deal. And also, environmental destruction, habitat loss, pollution. We're in a terrible state right now. Climate change, verging on climate catastrophe if we don't do something very, very soon. So that's also important. And then on the final level as well, we have this deeper connection with, let's call it a cosmic connection, with the universe itself. People feel just part of a whole system beyond the planet itself, and that can relate into a kind of spiritual connection as well in some respects, but not necessarily.
So what you just said comes after one of the very terrifying experiences for most of the people, and yeah, you can see that if you're turning to the blade of grass, it is very much terrifying. So I just remember someone asked me that because the reason why I'm mentioning this example, because for most of people it seems like that taking this thing means losing control, and this is why would you want to lose control, and that is one of the biggest thing, or it's terrifying, and it is something completely unnecessary. Now someone asked me and they were mentioning it and on MDMA, that how can I bring what I'm experiencing right now, which they explain as a present state where they see everything bright 3D, into my normal life, and it feels like that it actually connects to what you are saying, because once you are part of what you are experiencing at that point, and when you are saying that, yeah, you transcend and you connect to ecology and to the world, you can actually bring that to your default network if you are honest to what you experience over there. But at first, whatever control we think, and I think that is one of the biggest things, whatever control we think we have, we realize at that point that is actually when you are out of control. The control, actually, whatever the definition of your control is, if you think the control is the free will, if you think the control is to be connected to who you are, that would come after, when you let go of that fear of losing control. And that is a very enigmatic kind of a relationship. And it is, of course, terrifying, because always we have been told that a default network is the only and most important and sane network. Anything above or beyond is either crazy or not be respected. So I've seen some people who go there and think that this is crazy. There's no point. I don't want to believe it. Nonetheless, when they are back, they just are more connected and better. So how would you deny something which makes you more connected and beyond who you are, and actually allows you, like, even in daily life? I mean, I've seen, you have seen God, brilliant, like that is perfect. Yeah, what now? What else? What how you come back and you do it? I guess what I've seen other people doing it, I mean, I wish I would be ever able to be that present, but what I've seen other people doing it and telling me is that whatever you learn from there, you don't have to stick to it as a very strict ideology. If you bring it back and you are honest with it and you don't skip any steps, so you go back and you bring enough back that your daily life actually kind of becomes something around that present state. Not only that, it actually improve how you talk to your mother. Like, maybe that's the relationship you have, which is very hard to deal with. But if you're present and you're more open, and actually I've seen people's family relationship, which has been slowly broken apart, come together. I've seen people actually taking responsibility, personal responsibility, and at one level doing better. Either it is to do their job or to make somehow their family life better, which is a very odd connection. By seeing God, you become a better husband. I mean, but I mean, that is the somehow connection. That is the implication, which is very deeply rooted into our relationships. And of course, I mean, I can't imagine how great it would be if we can find out more about these experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. That was well put as well. I mean, I'd like to just kind of throw out a caveat there. I'm not saying everybody should suddenly take plant psychedelics, of course. I think, and I wouldn't advocate that either, but certainly I don't think these substances are necessarily for everybody. The clinical work shows that it's very beneficial to the majority of people. It doesn't necessarily suit everybody. But there are many other methods as well for achieving these states. And so, when I talk about psychedelics, it kind of includes various techniques of altered states more generally. But yeah, the idea of giving up control. I mean, like your own control mechanisms control you in a way as well. So there is something to be cherished about the liberation that you can get from going into these kind of divergent states of consciousness, if you like. And I think it is a little bit churlish to denigrate these experiences as in some way, stepping into this kind of uncontrolled state, this kind of crazy state. I think it's not necessarily beneficial to stay there. I would say, but I think the evidence would tend to suggest that, on the whole, most people benefit from accessing these altered states periodically, at the very least. And psychedelics needn't be the only way, of course, so it doesn't work for everybody. But there are huge benefits to be mined, I think, in exploring the potential uses of altered states for accessing these kind of more beneficial states. Where people are having mystical experiences and they're having better relationships. They become more happy in their job and nicer to their wives or whatever it is. So we find in the research they did a few years ago at Johns Hopkins, they were replicating this study called the Good Friday experiment, where they give a load of theologians actually psilocybin mushrooms in mass, and they found this kind of, the majority of them had given the psilocybin under placebo conditions, had this mystical experience. So at Johns Hopkins University, they followed that up a few years ago, and they also found that there was these huge increases in openness to experience as well. So openness to experience is one of these personality dimensions, which most personality dimensions become ossified. They just become embodied. They become stuck, by the age of about 30. People's personality doesn't change very much unless you have some major life changes. So like divorce, for instance. Seems to be beneficial for women generally, which says a lot about marriage, perhaps. And so those are going to have a shift in your personality. And they found that just in one high dose session of psilocybin, people had these massive shifts in their openness to experience, equivalent of 20 years of kind of gradual change, in a positive way, but only amongst those that had these kind of mystical experiences. It was more pronounced with people who had met God, for instance. Yes. And that have other knock-on effects, like, increased compassion, increased empathy, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot to be mined here, without kind of like foisting it on anyone. We're not talking about some kind of program of social control or anything like that, but there should be I think, and there will be in time, a facility for people to be able to access these states in a kind of safe and legal way.
Yeah, I mean, these are powerful plants and drugs. I mean, you can overdose. You can, of course. I mean,
you can't overdose on psilocybin.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, you can't overdose on psilocybin. You would just sleep, or I don't know.
I don't know. I think you'd have to eat something like the equivalent of like 8 kilos. It's not even physically possible.
Okay. Yeah. So of course, I mean, these are powerful. I mean, sometimes when we do say, "Oh yeah, this," a lot of other, I mean, I think humans would find a way to somehow kind of mix it with something else, or make it a routine where they would actually somehow destroy something. and then it becomes the problem where the news story comes and it's associated with, yes, well, of course they are very powerful, and your brain is full of chemicals, and that is chemical. If you mix something, what people die from water. I mean, if you
Yeah.
if you can
You
die
drink
from,
too much.
yeah, you die. Yeah.
Yeah.
So of course this is I mean, from both sides, I think some people, of course, who are doing the research or who advocate, they would say, no, this is completely safe. I think one argument which
I wouldn't say they're completely
no,
safe.
no, no, of
But
course.
in the right context, in the right setting, the right dosage or purity, you can reduce the risks hugely. I mean, physiologically, they're very safe. The known classic psychedelics, not all psychedelics, because there's a lot of new research kind of chemicals, so-called, some of which are toxic. Iboga's quite toxic. This has been used traditionally, but physiologically, things like psilocybin and LSD are very physiologically safe. There's no known overdose for those substances. There's very few side effects in acute use. There are potential risks of people having difficult psychological experiences, i.e. bad trips, which can be ameliorated by preparation, by the right setting, the right set, the right context, and also integration afterwards. And occasionally we see that people may have a prolonged psychotic reaction, but we don't think those people who have psychotic reactions are anything above the kind of background baseline of people who would develop psychosis anyway, because large-scale epidemiological studies are showing actually people have taken psychedelics, and then, unlike all other drugs, they're not at an increased risk of developing mental health conditions. In fact, they seem to be somewhat inoculated, or they're less likely to have mental health problems if they have taken psychedelics.
Yeah, so that is clear that if you do have some sort of a schizophrenic problem, maybe not somehow.
Well, it's controversial. I mean, certainly in the clinical work, we screen people out who have schizophrenia. But not only that, I mean, it's if you have schizophrenia, and I've met people who have schizophrenia who take psychedelics, and they say it's mostly it's they find it beneficial. Sometimes it can exacerbate their condition. It's not been studied clinically. Well, it was a little bit in the 60s. They actually used it as a treatment and had some successes with some what they used to call childhood schizophrenia, which now we call kind of severe autism. I've lost my train of thought a bit there, but. But also we screen out people who have first-degree relatives of schizophrenia. It's not so much necessarily people who have existing mental health conditions, because that's a kind of bit more of a known quantity, but maybe people who are at risk of developing them. So if you've got first-degree relatives with schizophrenia, you're in a higher risk category for then exhibiting it. And it could be that the psychedelic experience could be a catalyst for triggering the psychotic episode. Yeah. That's how we tend to view it. But of course, people do have difficult experiences. I get people being referred to me, contacting me, that had a difficult psychological experience and they haven't integrated it well, and they're exhibiting, poor mental health as a result.
Well, I mean, personally, I think that difficult experience, any difficult experience, whatever that is, it's not really, I would say, somehow physiologically toxic. Because it's mentally maybe difficult, but you get a lot out of it, definitely.
Yeah, on the whole, people tend to find them very psychologically beneficial. The psychological benefits, particularly in the more congenial context, of use, seem to far outweigh the negative psychological effects that are reported by a small minority.
You mentioned Iboga, and funny enough, this is what I really wanted to ask you. That Terence McKenna mentioned a lot about that. Oh, the mushrooms are somehow like a technology which has been made by plants, or it's some panspermia that the life came from somewhere else, and then this is one of the very crazy technologies which is very sophisticated. Although I was listening to another chemist. His name Hamilton Morris.
Oh, yeah.
So he mentioned about Iboga. He says that actually I don't think that mushrooms are that different, because it's somehow very classical kind of psychedelic. It's not that hard from from two-step you get to mushroom. It's not that. But he said iboga is like a 3D.
Yeah.
And he mentioned that it's like alien technology, and not only that, it also act upon various different mental states. So I mean, that would be great if I actually wanted to know more about this.
About iboga.
Yeah.
It's not. So the ibogaine is the chemical from iboga. The iboga is a root plant. The root of a plant, and it's a much more complex chemical than psilocybin, for instance. LSD is also somewhat of a complex chemical, but it's semi-synthetic, So this is a kind of plant-based chemical. It's in the same family of chemicals, tryptamine, and like all these different chemicals, they all give rise to different states of consciousness. They're all altered states of consciousness, and they have some generic similarities, but they have their own unique flavor to them as well. There's such a diversity of them. I mean, currently we figure there's about 500, or maybe more now, kind of known and tested different psychedelic substances, but they're increasing at an exponential rate. By a factor of 10 every 50 years. So 50 years from now, there'll be like 5,000 different psychedelic substances that have been known and tested. So the number's always increasing. They all have different properties and get you into different old states of consciousness. Some are more simple structurally and have more simple effects than others. So, for instance, like DMT seems to work on a huge range of different neuroreceptors, even some receptor systems in the brain which we haven't found neurotransmitters for, trace amine receptors and the sigma-1 receptor site as well. So we're also learning a lot about ordinary, everyday brain chemistry from exploring these substances, which is exciting times. But the whole idea of them being alien technologies is wonderful. Obviously, it's hard to kind of actually comment about that in a scientific way and say, well, yes, they are, or no, they're not. But I see a friend of mine, Andrew Gallimore, who I collaborate with, has just written a book called Alien Information Theory about DMT and biochemistry and also philosophy, the nature of mind. But they do seem to give you very sophisticated experiences. So, I mean, it always astonishes me how you go and see these indigenous tribal people who live a very, very simple existence on the land and, traditionally called primitive by our anthropologists of old. And they look so humble and simple. And then you sit with them and then you take the mushrooms or the peyote, whatever, and then the things you see are so far beyond any kind of thing we can imagine, and so sophisticated in their visionary technology that it's absolutely mind-blowing. And these guys are just sitting there looking like, they just crawled out of a bush, and yet they're having the most astonishing experiences, where they just transcend time and space and just, bring back these visions.
So DMT, of course, we are talking about DMT, and I think it would be interesting to actually go to these experiences. I mean, what do you actually see? What do you actually experience? Who do we meet over there? What is going on over there? Because DMT, as you said, we are finding a lot of different psychedelics, and this is supposed to be in nearly every plant. I mean, a lot of plants, majority of plants.
So many, probably. I mean, theoretically, all of them at very small quantities. Yeah.
So DMT is something which, when I was reading about tryptophan, which is, I think, one of the oldest common ancestors of life.
Yeah.
So and then, so this chemical exists at that point. So it would be great if you can introduce that, when life started and when this chemical appear and how we come to DMT and then we find it in ourselves. So
I'm not a I don't know what the term is for somebody who looks at the kind of archaeology of different chemicals, but yeah. So I mean, you have your essential chemicals, and so DMT comes in a little bit later. It's not totally essential for life. It's not a primary compound. It's called a secondary compound. So these are things that have evolved, which may be very common. So DMT is widely distributed, possibly in all plants. It seems to be in all mammals. It seems to be found in fish, amphibians, everywhere except insects and fungus. But fungus have their own version. It's called psilocybin, which is actually structurally very similar to DMT. So it's just only the insects, really, we think, we don't have it.
Is it the 5-MeO DMT, the one in fungus?
No, it's so it's 4-hydroxy DMT.
Okay.
Or is that bufotenine? I got them all, or 5-hydroxy, 4-hydroxy, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, which is psilocin. So it's a type of DMT. It's the same kind of basic structural as a DMT, NN-DMT, which we find everywhere else. So it's kind of widely occurring, but it's a secondary compound, but a very widely distributed and ancient one. Its wide distribution would suggest it's also very, very old. I mean, it's certainly much older than humans. Okay, so we've kind of co-evolved with DMT, which is astonishing. And these secondary plant compounds typically, or animal compounds in this case, are like the messenger compounds, the messenger molecules that plants use for communication, or other species use for communication, sometimes internally, as communication mechanisms between different parts of their organism, or externally as well. So, for instance, certain tomato plants will sample the saliva of aphids that attack them. They're able to identify the specific species, biochemically, and then release these kind of secondary compounds, these alkaloids, into the atmosphere, which will attract the specific predator for that specific aphid. So they're used to communicate and manipulate both the internal and the external environment. So they are like, collectively, you can think of them as the kind of, if you think of the whole ecosystem as being this kind of complex, symbiotic, sometimes parasitic interconnection of relationships between different organisms, these secondary compounds are like the neurotransmitters of the ecosystem. They're the things that communicate between all the different species existing within an ecosystem.
I did had one of the time this realization at some conscious altering experiences that, well, this is funny enough, because we do think that we are the only intelligent species, although now we are finding out with artificial intelligence research and some other findings which people are doing with the feedback loop of forest, that for intelligence you don't really need brain, you need somehow neural networks. That's what somehow creates intelligence, and that's why AI research were able to get some success, although they are finding a lot of difficulty in their limitation of sense of place. So if you don't have an agency, it's hard to somehow have a problem-solving experience, because it's just an abstract experience.
Sure.
Yeah. So
meaning is important.
Yes, meaning is very important. It's like one of the most important things.
It works for me.
Yes. So now we see that of course the plants in itself, which are connected to the land, and now they are doing a lot of soil and tree communication research for last 4 or 5 years. They're finding out more that how much they share resources, they talk to each other in a way that they spread like smells, where it actually discourages animals and also to the other plant species to change their structure, so that it's a lot of and then they also share nutrients underneath and allocate resources.
Absolutely.
And then they have a whole feedback system where you realize now we of course can see and travel that forest over here is impacting a desert over there. This is a very complex intelligent system.
Absolutely, yeah. It's super complex and super codependent. You affect one thing and it can have profound effects on the entire ecosystem. I just read this brilliant book, I Contain Multitudes, about microbiology and how by taking out sharks from a coral reef, you affect the whole ecosystem down to the coral. because it affects the sharks feed on the fish that feed on the little fish, which feed on the plankton, which then affects, if you take the sharks out, it affects the whole system. You get too much plankton, and then the coral dies basically because it becomes starved of oxygen. It just becomes strangled basically. So these all ecosystems are hugely interdependent and hugely interconnected, and of course there is all these complex communications going on. So to say that you can only really have intelligence or maybe even consciousness if you have a nervous system like a brain and a kind of central nervous system is I think is kind of falling out of favor as well. So people like Christoph Koch, for instance, talking about integrated information theory. It's about kind of integration and complexity, and if a system is suitably integrated and complex, it can have consciousness. And that could go from the molecular level all the way up to human brains, which is the most kind of complex integrated system that we know of. And you think of mycelia, some mycelia can stretch for several miles underground, and they're effectively like neural networks because they have billions upon billions of mycelial interconnections, and in which the same way we have neurotransmitter, different, probably hundreds of different neurotransmitters. Some fungus have hundreds of different genders, so you've got these extremely complex underground communication orgies, like quite literally orgies, going on with mycelia. And so what makes us think they're not conscious? It's
arrogant.
Yeah, arrogance. Yeah, I think it's a kind of human species centricism and hubris, really, to presume and assume that we're the only conscious or the most conscious kind of beings on the planet.
I mean, we are very powerful species, to be honest. So it's not somehow a stretch. It's actually a side effect of being powerful, which somehow has been allowed by the nature in itself. Although that is a tricky point where that opens up a door where you're very powerful. Yeah, of course, you have been allowed to be very powerful, and maybe we are experimenting, and maybe we are now separated from evolution, and maybe that might be the reason, which opens up a door where something that complex is something maybe having intelligence. Let's not even bring in consciousness to make it easier. If you take plants, you literally are taking DMT sometimes. In ayahuasca form or some other forms. But let's say even if you're DMT is pretty much synthetic. So even if you're taking that, yes, you are communicating at a completely different level. But ayahuasca particularly, you are somehow mixing those chemicals with your chemicals to have an interspecies kind of dialogue, which we think that, that's not even a possibility. Although if we know that this is a very complex intelligent system, and intelligence communicating in whatever way, maybe pre-language, however that might be, that can have profound effects. And that might not only be what you think or your past memories or your visions or your unfelt traumas. Yes, that's all, part of it. But I think that is one of the reasons why some intelligence is telling a very powerful species, and I think I hear this message a lot, that you are arrogant and you need to see. Well, that's the problem. Not me. That's the pure definition of human, right here.
Exactly.
You are.
Yeah, exactly.
We are arrogant. So that's what the message is there.
Absolutely.
Why? I don't know. Maybe I'm assuming it, but I've heard this a lot. That the message is very clear about the destruction of environment, also. And regarding that you do think that you run the show, but that's not. But you.
Well, it's like this difference between like you said, it's like us viewing ourselves as being apart from nature instead of a part of it. Like we're looking at nature like it's a zoo, and really, we are nature, we're part of this really super complex integrated system, this whole, this biome, this microbiome, this macrobiome, this is the planet, and so I think that the message coming through, which often people report, it's not just like, oh, they take psychedelics and they feel more connected. It's often, there's some chastising usually going on in there. It's like, come on, wake up, you monkeys. What are you doing? Like, haven't you had enough yet? Aren't you sick of all this like pollution and depression, anxiety, and just like, what are you doing? Look at the mess you're making. You've killed off half of the wildlife on the planet in the last few decades. That's astonishing. The species are dying at a terrifying rate. We could have entire ecosystem collapse. We could be looking at absolute disaster. Like we could be seeing the displacement of millions of people through various ecological disaster, food shortages. Food security could completely go out the window. Could be riots, famines, cannibalism. I mean, that's what we could be looking at. We have to really seriously stare that in the face and accept that this is all human-made as well. And this could be our future very, very soon. So, yeah, it's important that we do wake up and feel more kind of ecoism rather than egoism, that we become more ecologically orientated. And connect with our environment and be part of it, not apart from it. And I think plant psychedelics are a very profound way of accessing that. Yeah, you can have that through meditation. We find it as well, actually, people have near-death experiences. They tend to become more higher, more empathic, more humanitarian, and also more ecologically engaged as well. There's various ways to wake up, I think, but it needs to happen on a kind of collective level across a whole species, or our fate, and perhaps half of the species on the planet or more is also in the balance.
Okay, so I mean, yeah, I don't think I can add anything to that. But now this, I think, if we really want to bring some systems, what is going on, I think for me personally, one of the most important thing, which I think is what you mentioned about somehow creating an embassy where we can explore the DMT spaces. Now, a DMT space is something which is a reality, which is a hallucination. There's a different definition, and definitions goes on and on and on.
Mm-hmm.
And then, but you experience something, and sometimes you experience it in just pure abstraction. Sometimes you experience it as in entities.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes, I think there's a less of that experience that you completely forget who you are. But most of the time, people kind of know that there's an observer observing. There's an interaction with entities. I think for me at this point, this is one of the most important thing, and I loved that idea. I mean, it is practical, first of all, although it looks amazingly romantic, and I think that is one of the biggest example of brilliant ideas, that they look, if you read the line, that my goodness, that is romantic. I mean, this is passionate, although if you look deeper into it, it is scientifically and empirically possible to actually do it if we are somehow slowly, move towards that direction.
Yeah, sure.
I would love to know more about that line.
Yeah, so I mean, the notion of DMT entities, encounters with other than new beings in an altered state under the influence of DMT. I mean, it's the idea's been around for a while. It's very prevalent. People who have a high dose DMT experience with ayahuasca or with DMT will, and the majority have an encounter experience. Okay, so it's very, very prevalent. It's also quite reliable, not 100%, but it's and people. The most astonishing thing is that people feel like it's more real than their everyday waking real. It has such a kind of profundity and intensity and reality to it that it challenges your very notion of what reality is, that you feel that you have had contact with some other than you being. And, these come in all shapes and sizes, a bit often like little tricksy, little elfy, know-me characters, or very profound deity-like beings or angelic beings or super intelligent kind of consciousness that you encounter. And so we're trying to get to the bottom, or I'm trying to get to the bottom with some colleagues, what is the nature of these things? It's very difficult to kind of attack what is basically a metaphysical phenomena from a positivist scientific perspective and say, okay, so what's the nature of these beings, and is it just a production of our own psychology under the influence of psychoactive drugs, or is there some way in which we can say that we can explore these things at face value as well and say, okay, they may actually be real in some sense. And a lot of my colleagues will just laugh at the very notion of even trying to engage with this question. But I think it's important because it speaks to the very nature of reality itself, which is no small thing.
No. I mean, I actually been trained, of course, as a social researcher, and yes, of course, it's a hard pill to swallow.
Yeah.
And also, because I've grown up in a lot of stories, a lot of myths, and just tons of it's an open university system. So I know just by instincts that there's just a lot which people can get lost into. So my reaction, as you can always imagine, if I'm going to a school which I'm getting rationalized, my reaction is, how Buddhists say that there was a mountain and then there was not, and that's what I was like, nope, this is like too much.
Yeah.
And I needed to get out of it. So I can see from,
of course,
the other perspective, like, very clearly. Although, as I'm reading more and I'm researching more into it, because my topic for PhD, which I'm trying to also look for, include a lot of psychedelic experiences. So
fantastic.
I mean, I've been looking for it for last 4 or 5 years. So I didn't read all that in last week. So
that'd be impressive.
Yeah. Well, not really. Yeah, no. But one thing which I realized that there's if a lot of people are trying to find out what is the nature of consciousness or what is the nature of reality is.
Yeah.
Now, we are definitely part of whatever reality we are experiencing. Now we have consciousness, although this is the notion where you do see entities, and I've realized that to understand what those entities are is very, very important. Although an entity experienced by a consciousness tells you as much about you as it tells you about its own existence.
Absolutely.
Now that question is actually so essential that if you are really trying to find out what the nature of consciousness is, I think that is fundamental.
I happen to agree
to that
yeah,
question.
Totally.
Not only that, there's Nick Bostrom. He's
the simulation hypothesis. Yes, of course.
I mean, simulation hypothesis. I mean, this actually fits into. Well, he says I can quickly just. It would be good if you have any connection with.
I mean, like to some extent, it's like the kind of Matrix hypothesis. Like we're living in a Matrix. Like in the film The Matrix, it's like it's a simulation, or it's actually not a simulation. It's because it's not simulating anything else. It is what it is. But it's like you're stuck within an artificial world, basically, which is being programmed by some higher order beings to make it appear to us as real, and somehow we're experiencing it as real. But actually, it's an illusionary world that has been generated for us.
So he puts 3 aspects. He says that either all the technological civilizations who are capable of actually building a virtual reality dies off because they destroy either themselves or they somehow find a piece of technology which no matter what your level of advancement is, somehow destroys them. So the thing which you find that has a consequences which destroys. It's terrifying. Second is that the civilization which has the technology to actually build certain simulated realities where you can actually run, history and find out about you can simulate it and you can run it back and what happened to the dinosaurs. Like, really, they actually lose interest in that and no one pursue that. Like, none of the people in whole of the universe pursue anything like that. Or third, we do make it, and the probability of that is that either one of them making another one and then continuing to make a lot of it. So the probability of you being the only one original civilization is pretty thin.
Sure.
Although what is the interesting point about this and what people agree is that they say, well, that doesn't discount that to be an illusionary reality. That's different from also what sometimes people would call it illusion or dream, and dream in a way where they use it in a very discounted way, not in our not the phenomenology of the DMT studies, but the social research studies. So they say that, well, if you want to know what is the consciousness, what is the nature of your reality, is the beings who were there are actually under the influence of their own physical laws, but they are not under the ones which they have created. So they are like kind of gods in that way. Although the turtles can go all the way up.
Absolutely.
And that is the concept which comes all the time in layers.
So which level of the matrix are you in, right?
Yes.
And who's the one making it right at the top, or is there a top, you know?
But not only that, he mentions one very important thing, which I think connects to what you are saying, is that if you want to explore what is the nature of your reality, you definitely explore the nature of your environment. But I think I have just a slightly different view. I think, well, if you are the simulated kind of a character who somehow is a messenger which moves around, it's pretty powerful. If you poke in, and as we are poking in a lot into Hadron Collider, we should definitely see that. I think it blows me away. It actually sometimes bring me to tears that we are like looking into something so crazy, and we are trying to look into these very small particles. But if there's a virtual reality argument where humans actually can build a microscope and look inside of their own somehow stretch marks of their own existence, that can show, according to actually very credible scientists, like it's a scientific view, the nature of your reality, which could actually tell who built you, because that would actually not be very separated.
Interesting.
So, I mean, what are we doing with DMT? We are actually stretching the fabric of where we are. Now, that is actually fits in exactly what you are writing about, that line. And I'm reading this and I'm thinking, this is actually very important. what like they are trying to say could be done right now if we really try to look into these, because I haven't had that encounter yet. But I'm sure that encounter is something which I am associating to the stretching of reality. So it would be great to...
It certainly expands your horizons on your experience of the world. Yeah, for sure. There's like kind of a before DMT and after DMT kind of view on what is possible to experience. So yeah, there's definitely a stretching or a stretching, let's call it, of reality for sure. As with all other states, But yeah, it's a super interesting talk. I think, it's so difficult to actually get at in an experimental way, and it's interesting that there's so many kind of fields of research now, which are really highlighting the fact that the way we actually ordinarily perceive the world is not as it is. So this great book recently, The Order of Time. Time is somehow just completely illusionary. It's like a perceptional driven thing that we somehow create the time with our consciousness. Physics is telling us this. There's some astonishing things that coming out of physics which make my kind of area of research look really, really tame, to entertain the idea of like interspecies communication or telepathy or literally kind of parting from your body. It is insignificant almost in terms of what we're understanding about the nature of reality from physics currently. It's mind-blowing. So I think there's a lot to learn and a lot to discover, and I think, but we shouldn't be shy of exploring these realms. in an open and honest way. Let's not just, which science has often been done in these kind of realms, in the realm of the transpersonal and altered states, has often just been consigned to this kind of catch-all dustbin of hallucination. And I think it's far more nuanced than that. And there's a lot we can learn, not just about neurobiology, but about the nature of who we are, fundamentally as well. So let's try and explore this phenomenon. Can we, in fact, find some kind of signals or patterns of commonalities of these encounters which go beyond some simple reductionistic explanation? It may well be that there is a kind of particular module in your brain which somehow seems to create rather invasive, emotionless praying mantises that operate on you, which seems to be a very common experience on DMT amongst people who weren't aware of it. There may be a part of your brain which somehow triggers that particular subset of experiences in a reliable way. I don't know what that part of your brain is doing in there. That begs even more questions. But I think we need to be just approaching this in a very open way and really looking at what's going on and how we can understand the data, the evidence of what's happening. If Nick Bostrom can get away with his assuredness of this simulation hypothesis, then we shouldn't necessarily so easily discredit the nature of these entities, perhaps, on DMT.
Well, I think the gap between we here sitting, which are somehow, cooked in some sun, or no, not in sun, sorry. Sun was not even there when we were cooked, maybe. Some sort of a star.
Yeah.
And we are definitely somehow words and carbon. That's a weird combination anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And the language, how it was formed and how it evolved. So the gap from there to here is big and huge. So I think if we need to close that gap, we have to take a little bit of an adventurous steps and brave ones. And as you're saying, which include a lot of openness.
Absolutely. Yeah, one of the things I've really been intrigued by is one phenomenon from DMT is extra-dimensional percepts, which has received no real attention, I don't think, in that the majority of people who have high-dose DMT experience geometric visual percepts, which seem to have more than 3 spatial dimensions. Many, in some cases. People try and explain them as it's beyond the ordinary understanding of dimensionality. We don't really understand visual perception enough. There's some kind of miracle that occurs when we go from electrochemical signals to this 3D interactive holodeck we call vision. Mental imagery, again, is another kind of step from there, but we understand the visual geometry of 3 dimensions. We can experience it, but we don't understand. We can't even imagine, I don't think, unless you have the experience of a 4th dimensional space, dimensions, more than 3 spatial dimensions. And yet this is commonly reported on psychedelics and only has any corollary in physics, like in M theory, when physicists talk about having 11 dimensions of space-time. So it'd be interesting to see perhaps what physicists would make of DMT experiences of encountering these high dimensional percepts. I think there's some tools to be used here for some exploration of state-specific sciences, as Charles Tart said, of exploring science from within altered states of consciousness. And I was lucky enough to have been involved in some research where we took 40 top-level scientists and engineers from various top universities and gave them LSD, most of them for the first time, with a view to looking at their own research problems. Some astonishing things came from the physicists. It was really, truly wonderful. So I think there's an opportunity here to think kind of interdisciplinarily and explore our understanding of these concepts from inside these old states as well, for insight purposes.
Has mathematicians have taken it? Is there a study where
well, we didn't have many mathematicians. We did have at least one higher order mathematician, high dimensional mathematician, who was, it was fantastic. It was basically able to see his equations in a kind of visual analog form rather than just as a string of algebra.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think, this is because there's another physicist, David Deutsch.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting. I would highly recommend.
Mm-hmm.
I think after listening to him, I definitely had to go to sleep. No. I was overstimulated.
Yeah, right.
I couldn't do anything else.
Yeah.
It's that kind of
Amazing.
Yeah. So he actually and I think there is no one who can actually dispute or argue with what he's saying. He's saying that the knowledge exists independent, and it's a property of universe.
Mm-hmm.
And there is always ever discovering knowledge which exists, which humans would discover rather than create.
Mm-hmm.
Hence, it's some sort of independent existence,
Mm-hmm.
and a property which would not somehow be captured in only the physical aspect of universe. Although you can have experiments, but the realms where there's these, I don't think he used the word realms, but these two would be separated. And I think if this is one of the theories which he's bringing in, so I could not imagine if the physicists who actually believe that this is what it is. I mean, it's very complicated. I'm trying to just condense it as much as possible. I mean, I definitely try to write it down. I can try to explain it, but it's going to take way longer, and I might have to just that's it. But I think if this is something which somehow can be translated through this research, I think it would be was I able to explain it in some way?
I kind of get that. I like that. It's like a self-existent property of the universe. That knowledge is something not man-made. It's something discovered. It's like there, which is something different from either information or data.
Yeah. And there's a theory about as we talked about meaning. So meaning somehow is you have a resistance.
Yeah.
And you challenge whatever challenge you have or problem you have, and then you improve, and then in that you find meaning, and somehow you unlock your potential.
Yeah.
And especially humans have been rewarded evolutionary to explore different spaces. So I mean, what else? Even if you're trying to find out human potentiality, even if you're trying to find out a potential which is somehow related to knowledge, what other state other than psychedelic states, or actually not only just psychedelic states? I think a lot of psychedelic plants put you through a lot of scrutiny, where you challenge each and every aspect of who you are. I mean, I guess there's a lot of vomiting also.
Not always.
Not always. Not always. There's a lot of initial sick feeling from some people. I mean, there's a lot of confrontation of whatever fears or illusions we are living in. So
very much so. I mean, not always, but often, yeah. I mean, it can be that you first have to kind of traverse through your own unconscious sewer and your shadow, and until you can emerge out into the light, But the more you delve into the shadow, the further into the light you can probably extend as well.
You okay with time?
I'm going to have to head off soon, actually, but no, I'm really loving this.
No.
How are we doing for time?
We are 5:45.
Oh, I should probably go. I've got my PhD
yeah.
student waiting.